if, for example, we indulge in this myth that women are naturally more compassionate, more empathetic, that also means we have to be less good at certain things. Yeah. So what are we going to be less good at? Decisiveness, strategic clarity, the ability to make tough decisions, which will just reinforce the existing stereotypes that women belong in caring leadership positions and not in business leadership positions. And I think that is a very dangerous trajectory.
Welcome back to The Tea with Nikki. We are pro-tea, not anti-coffee. And what you can find on The Tea with Nikki is candid conversations with women who are industry leaders, whether they are in the corporate space, sports field, or even entrepreneurs governing their own business. They spill the tea on how they got to where they are today, their failures along the way. We have some fun and interesting moments too. Today I sit with Ramona Libroff, who has 25 years experience in building and leading high performance teams that focus on early stage investment and impact, innovation, and in the emerging market sphere. She was previously in marketing, found her way after an awful moment into financial advisory, and she has a master's from Yale University and also from the London School of Economics. She believes that she is a lifelong learner, and she has really incredible insights as to what she believes the gender roles of leadership is and whether they should exist or not. I wanted to add in why I took a little break from The Tea with Nikki. I wanted to start doing these in seasons to sort of bring it all together, make sure that I have a set trajectory and where I want to go and a plan, and the type of woman I want to interview, as well as having different focuses, because I've been speaking to a lot of women who are in corporate. I'd love to speak to more athletes as well, and more entrepreneurs, which is awesome too. As you can see, I'm not in my usual space, so this is also why I took a bit of a beat, not necessarily because of the seasons, but because I'm not in my usual space. I've been so distracted, there's been so much going on. I flew up to Pretoria for one of my best friends' supposed to have been weddings, which was actually disappointing that she couldn't have it now and we couldn't see her be the most beautiful bride ever. But it was such a blessing in the fact that I got to spend 12 days with two of my best friends that I only get to see once a year. So it's been a very special and near dear time for me. I've been working in the meantime, doing Future Females, and unfortunately I didn't have the capacity to also edit my videos. But I'm glad I had a little season break. I got to recoup, and I'm going to be back and better than ever. Hi, Ramona.
Hey, Nikki. How are you?
Good, thanks. And yourself?
I'm fine, thank you.
So you regard yourself as a global SDG investor. What does SDG stand for, and what does that mean exactly?
The SDGs are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they're basically a to-do list for what we should do as a world together, a planet and society, in order to make a world that we all want to live in. So some of them are obvious, like climate actions, reducing inequality, strong institutions. But many of them are areas that could actually be addressed with innovation, which requires investment. So a lot of what I do is both personally and kind of institutionally work to get capital into the innovations that are actually going to fund the achievement of these goals. Luckily, the SDGs are also extremely well documented, and you can basically figure out exactly where a certain company contributes to them. So it makes it pretty helpful for everyone to have a common language.
You've also been involved in several innovative roles in well-known and established companies such as Nielsen in London, Innogy SE in Berlin. What does someone do as an SVP or COO of an innovation practice? And what does that mean as well?
Right, well, they were quite different roles actually. So for about 10 years, I was in charge of agency teams that worked with large clients all around the world. And the role of those teams, we were basically paid to help our clients like Unilever or PepsiCo with their innovation work. And what that means is basically ensuring that when they launched a new product to market, that it was successful, that it was priced appropriately, that there was a consumer need driving it, that it was in the right place, that it was advertised properly, that it actually had a reason to exist. So that was sort of the roles at somewhere like Nielsen, where you're really effectively an outsourced arm of a client that's global and trying to push into new markets with new products. At Innogy, it was slightly different because there I was the chief operating officer of their internal venture fund. And it basically combined investing in startups that were building the future of the energy system, but also had a number of internal spin-outs and developments. And in both of these roles, you're responsible for two things primarily. You're responsible for how the resources, the money and the talent are used, and you're responsible for the results. Both are quite challenging because obviously innovation is by definition hard to predict. So you've got to be quite nimble, and you've also got to be quite unafraid of making some fairly brutal decisions to stop doing things so that you can carry on doing others. That's it in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, and it's so difficult, I can imagine, because there's just so much that's below the surface that you have to also get to and address in the title and in what you're doing.
Well, I think one of the toughest things about a role like that is the politics. So for example, if you are leading a very large client relationship for an agency, your own company has goals and interests, right? They want you to keep growing the relationship. They want you to keep being more profitable. However, your client also has goals and interests. They want the best people on their business, and they want to get the best deal that they can. So you're constantly balancing those interests against each other. It's fine as long as everyone is reasonable, but that's very rarely the case.
Yeah. Human nature, unfortunately.
I think it's structures actually rather than nature. I wouldn't put it down to, I actually find individuals to be reasonable, but often the structures under which they work and the pressure under which they work to be quite unreasonable. Okay. So I'm a little more optimistic on human nature.
Okay, so I just want to go off that a little bit, off the back of that. Mm-hmm. So you say you think it's a bit more to do with the structure than the actual human nature. What do you mean by the structure of it exactly?
Look at how most large companies are managed, right? First of all, they're quite complex. They exist in many, many countries. There's a lot of history there. Occasionally, a company will be built of many other companies that predated it, all with their own cultures and their own norms. It's difficult to get information around and really get to a clear perspective on any given issue. Also, people are always trying to do quarterly forecasts. When as we did, we ran more than 1,000 projects a year. A quarterly forecast is a bit odd because you frankly have no idea exactly how much is going to come in. And often you have to spend 3 to 6 months developing an opportunity. So what does a quarterly forecast really tell you? Not a great deal. So I think just sometimes some of the measures and some of the systems that we put in place, and by the way, the ones that also privilege individual activity or trying to take individual credit over team activity, don't help us very much.
I also see that you've been involved in quite a few accelerator and incubators in your career. What drew you to this?
Well, I ran one, and a very specific one at that. It was called SPRING, and it was basically looking at companies in East Africa and South Asia, tasking them with innovating for the needs of adolescent girls who tend to be a very forgotten about population, but then also promising to try and find impact investment if those models were commercially viable. It may sound impossible, but actually quite a few of the companies managed to do that. The reason why an accelerator is such an interesting and exciting place is, first of all, you're creating a community of change makers. So you're building links, partnerships, and you're also helping everyone achieve more than they could individually. So that's exciting. It's also exciting because it's fast paced. In many of these cases, you have very little time to figure out where and how to put your best support in for the business. So that kind of focuses the mind. So I often find you can do as much in a 30-minute or an hour call or meeting for a startup than you could over the course of several months working with them. Somehow all the value is concentrated in that early piece, as long as, of course, you understand the field really well and you've distilled some understanding of what the startup needs. And I think as long as you're focused on what the startup needs rather than what you need. So I think accelerators are great. You know, as long as they have a clear focus and as long as they have the right support, they can be a brilliant way of bringing a lot of good very quickly.
And what are you currently doing in your career?
So I'm looking, basically. What happened to us is we basically became Brexit refugees. When it looked like Brexit would happen, we bought a flat in Berlin. I happened shortly after that to get a job in Berlin, the job at Innogy that I hoped would be a job that would last for many years. It was an executive level role, it was global, it carried significant responsibility, and all of the incentives in Germany are aligned toward long-term employment. However, because the company was broken up and merged with others, almost everyone lost their job in this particular area. So within 2 years, I was out of a job again and found myself really enjoying life in Berlin, but without any network or any real career fit. There's not much sustainable finance or innovation work happening in Germany. It tends to be mainly in Europe. It's in Switzerland or in Amsterdam or in London primarily, or in the US, none of which were really in the past willing to hire remotely, especially at senior levels. So what I've been doing instead is I had another almost year working on Spring. I've had a year working on Reforestation Finance, which is really, really interesting because it's one of these classically very difficult to fund areas. It's kind of easy to fund a new solar farm or a new wind farm because you know what you're building and you know how much it will pay you. So it's pretty easy to model. But when you're actually looking at what it takes to restore a landscape and then try and build a number of other revenue models on top, whether that's sustainable tourism or carbon, a lot of these are question marks. You don't know how long it will take. So you have to get quite creative. It's not as simple, for example, in the venture capital space where you just write a check and take a stake in a company. You actually have to bring together a whole set of actors, and you have to find debt financing, you have to find public finance. So I've become much more interested in the whole scope of sustainable finance through work like this. And that's what I'm doing at the moment while I try and find the right people to do this with longer term.
Bring me to this question that I ask everyone that graces me on my channel. What does leadership mean to you?
Well, let me give this a little bit of context. I have, in addition to starting my career in marketing, I also have a master's in social psychology. And what a lot of the research will tell you, as opposed to the headlines, is that a lot of the gender differences when it comes to professional roles and such as leadership are really overstated. But the problem is, because we're humans and we yearn for simplicity, we try and encode certain leadership traits or behaviors with one gender or the other. And when there is a mismatch, then we basically punish the person who is not conforming. So for example, if a male leader were seen to be overly empathetic, he might be seen as soft. If a female leader were seen to be decisive, she might be seen as aggressive. We try and keep people in their boxes. And because of that, I actually reject the idea of keeping people in their boxes. It is interesting, however, that women have pioneered many, many things, especially if I look at sustainable finance. I'd say 80% of the leadership in sustainable finance, which is itself a new field, are women. I don't think that's a coincidence, because I do think if you are in the margins for whatever reason, gender, race, ethnicity, mindset, background, education, class, whatever it is, you will often have the privilege of an objective view. You won't take things for granted. And you will also, frankly, have to push extremely hard to be taken seriously and overcome things. So to the extent that there is such a thing as female leadership, I think it is that women have to be better than the norm, are often isolated and alone and seen as the representation of all women, wherever they are, if they're in male-dominated fields, and often have quite an interesting way of looking at things from that experience. I hope we'll reach a point, Nikki, when there's no such thing as male or female leadership, there's only good leadership.
I agree with you. I just asked the question because there are those common associations where compassion, empathy, those sorts of things are often associated with feminine qualities. So I want to speak into this voice, and I thank you so much for sharing about what you said about studying social psychology and the dynamics of that. And I'm finding this conversation about gender coming up more and more. So I just want to hear, it's interesting to hear everyone's different perspective on what feminine leadership is. And I think maybe I must change the way I ask the question, because I'm finding I am agreeing with you. I don't want to compartmentalize what good leadership is. Good leadership is good leadership. But I'm wanting to emphasize or stress the point that I think the world could do with more of these sorts of feminine leadership qualities, or maybe there should be more kind of stokes of fires within women to want to become leaders in the industry.
Well, there's two different things there. One is, I think these qualities are human. I think to say that compassion and empathy are exclusively female qualities is a disservice to everyone. And the reason why I say that is that also means that if, for example, we indulge in this myth that women are naturally more compassionate, more empathetic, that also means we have to be less good at certain things. So what are we going to be less good at? Decisiveness, strategic clarity, the ability to make tough decisions, which will just reinforce the existing stereotypes that women belong in caring leadership positions and not in business leadership positions. And I think that is a very dangerous trajectory. So what I would say is that overall, we need leadership to be more human. We need leaders to be people with all of their complexities and vulnerabilities. We need them to have their empathy switched on from, entirely, and not pretend that leadership is something that can be divorced from humanity, rather than putting female leadership on some kind of pedestal from which it cannot actually be effective. It will always remain in the margins.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your answer. And this brings me to the section I like to call the ABCs of your career. So what was your amazing affluent aha moment?
The aha moment. Well, I can think of many, but one that stands out for me is right when I was switching away from marketing and into this whole new exciting global development, social innovation investment space. I was in rural Tanzania doing a piece of work looking at the needs of mobile users. And bear in mind, at the time, only 10 years ago, very, very few people outside the big cities used mobile. So I was out and about in town and I was trying to find something on my iPad and I just felt something behind me. And in context, I was about 100 kilometers away from kind of the nearest regional town. So quite far from the capital, very much in the countryside, in a small town that had been built as a mining outpost for diamonds way back when in the 19th century and had fallen out of favor when the mines closed. So I looked behind me and I realized there were about 40 children who'd been following me for some time, staring at my iPad and trying to figure out what it was. And I thought, wow, I take for granted having all the world's information right here. That just made me kind of more committed to the mission of making sure that everyone in the world has access to the things that many of us take for granted. And I had the same feeling, by the way, when I was telling this story at a conference in San Francisco, where everyone in the audience was a smartphone user and couldn't imagine anyone who wasn't.
And B, what was a bad business blunder turned to blessing?
This is a great question. And I think there was a real turning point in my career. In my late 20s, I was hired by a listed company as a director of the company, so with full responsibility. I thought I was great, right? You know, here I am, 28 years old, in charge of a division, amazing, any media division. What I realized was actually the company had hired me to try and pretend that it wasn't actually fraudulent. And they thought I'd be too dumb to figure it out. And to be fair, I almost didn't figure it out. It was only when I was looking through some paperwork over the weekend at the office that I realized what was happening. So my blunder was I went into the chairman and I said, look, I cannot in good conscience, fulfilling my duties as a director, continue in this field. Here, I hereby resign. Now the company was about to be sold. If I'd kept my mouth shut, I probably would have walked away with about 1.6, 1.7 million pounds at that point. What happened instead was that the chairman panicked that the sale might fall through because of some stupid child who was ready to blow the whistle. Basically went to every headhunter he knew and said, don't hire her, she's crazy, she's an insane human being. So that when I quit this job and tried to find another job, I couldn't. And I couldn't figure it out until one of the headhunters, taking pity on me, basically said, look, you're poison, get out of town. So at that point, I actually ended up working in the US again. And that kickstarted my career in a completely different direction. So even though it was awful at the time, and I can't describe how humiliated, how embarrassed, how lonely that was, it made me absolutely clear that for me, ethics were non-negotiable. And it's something I've tried to keep going with ever since that point. So I think it was a blunder turned blessing in the end.
Definitely, it was definitely a redirection. And now look where you are. You've been in incredible incubators, accelerators. And C, what was a comical cinematic moment for you?
Oh God, so I as soon as I read that question, this popped into my head and I couldn't get rid of it, so I'll just tell the story. For about 3 years, I was commuting between New York and London because I was leading the PepsiCo relationship globally. And their head office is outside of New York City. You have to get there on a train. It's quite a long way. I think I was jet lagged for about the entire 3 years. And it happened to be, there was one, beautiful late summer morning. I'd gotten myself onto the train. I had kind of 45 minutes ahead of me to just chill out. I got up at one point and there was a nail or something sticking out of one of the side, the seats. And I felt my trousers rip completely from waist to thigh. And this rush of cool air as basically my clothing stopped covering my ass. And I was just like, oh no, I've got this board meeting, I'm going to be late. So I literally ran out of the station, kind of clutching my trousers together, So I didn't have a coat or anything. It was really nice weather. I didn't, it was just me in my broken trousers. And I was like, said to the cab, I was like, take me to the nearest shopping mall. It was 3 minutes to opening time. I ran into the shop. I bought a pair of trousers. I threw them on. I got back in the cab and I got to headquarters and I was 2 minutes early. And I was like, a sweating, and this pair of trousers didn't really fit me very well, because they were like winter trousers, because that's all there was in the shop. I mean, I was just so grateful not to
be late.
Have my ass flapping in the wind.
Not
so hopefully that
meeting.
Hopefully you can picture that would have been a scene in a movie for sure.
Definitely. She's about to go make her pitch. She's got her books and that does sound dramatic moment.
It was.
Awesome. Now it's the challenge part.
So it's a gem. It's red. It's a birthstone. Yes. There is a place that I'm going to sit there for a second. I don't even know what that one is. Someone on a jury who's the person who tries to get everyone together in a trial.
Judge, prosecutor.
Of the jurors, who leads the jurors?
I don't know.
Pass. Okay. There's not.
The timeout.
Definitely did not.
What was it?
Got one. It was a foreman of a jury.
It's the very famous museum in Paris. It's got the triangle.
The Louvre.
Yes. One of the richest countries in the world, next to Switzerland.
Liechtenstein, Luxembourg.
Yes. It was one of. Okay, what comes after 10?
11.
And it was one of the space missions up into space.
Apollo 11.
Yes. Okay, time's up. That was good.
Not bad.
5. So it was Apollo 11, Louvre, Paramore. I wouldn't know how to describe that. I only know them as a music.
Yeah. Someone who is adored, but not officially. I might have thought concubine, paramour,
You've taught me a new word today, paramour. Luxembourg and musket. I don't know musket.
Musket's like a gun, like an old gun.
Okay,
Is it musket or muscat? Which
musket.
Musket. Okay, like bang bang. Okay, like long thin lock, stock, and 2 shooting barrels. A musket is the gun in lock, stock. So
now that brings me to the lightning round, quick fire round, where I just ask you a few questions, 5 questions, and you just get off the top of your head. Are you a morning person or an evening person?
Morning. Earlier the better.
I'm also 5 a.m. and people can't understand it, and it's just makes life so easy because then I can enjoy my day. Anyway, what is one thing in your daily routine that you could not live without?
My bicycle. I basically cycle everywhere, and it gives me the chance to think, some fresh air, some exercise. Me and my bike, like this.
I love that. And what are 2 books that changed your life?
This is the hardest question, like only 2. It's just unfair. But I did think in the spirit of feminism, I thought Down Girl by Kate Moss was a really good explanation of why misogyny exists. It's horrifying and I highly, highly recommend it. It really opened my eyes. And then on a slightly lighter note, I love Japanese literature, and there's an amazing author called Haruki Murakami who also runs a jazz bar. It's very unusual, and he's a lead translator of hard-boiled American fiction. And he wrote a book called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, which is itself a play on a Raymond Carver title of What I Think About, or What I Write About. So it was basically him becoming an ultra-marathoner at 50 and writing about that experience. So those are just 2. I could have mentioned 150.
Who are 3 people that you would have over for a dinner party, dead or alive?
Oh, this is also really, 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 really tough. Okay. So Artemisia Gentileschi was a Renaissance painter who was really the only woman painting at the time, and I wonder what life would have been like for her. So I'd like to bring her back and hear her story. Someone alive who I've had the privilege of having dinner with, but I was not alone and I would love to talk to her more, is Margaret Atwood. She is amazing. And then actually, I would quite like to invite one of the people who started the US, one of the sort of so-called founding fathers, and make them account for a few of the things they put in the Constitution. So I'm not sure which one I pick, but maybe Madison or Hamilton.
Interesting choices. And last question, what is your favorite kind of tea?
Russian Caravan, because it carries a sort of hint of exotic lands and it's also very strong. It's a bit like Lapsang Souchong. It's a kind of strong blend of Russian tea with some citrus oils, and it's delicious.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the Tea with Nikki, Ramona. I really appreciate it. And for taking the...
A pleasure. It's a great format. Thank you so much for putting all the thought into it and for the conversation.
I absolutely loved speaking to Ramona. It was so amazing having an academic on the channel with me. She just knows so much, and I would consider myself quite a good 30 seconds player, but she just knew everything else. So I collapsed a little bit. I loved what she had to say about gender traits, whereas it's compassion, empathy, but then it also takes away from, decisiveness, assertiveness, which is then why are we compartmentalizing what is male and female? Why can we not just say that is a good leader? And I think that definitely going forward, that should be the perspective. But unfortunately, I think in the current climate, there is the stress of the gender divide currently what's going on in society. But I'm with you, Ramona. I agree. Let's move towards good leadership and not gender-based leadership. And I would just like to thank Ramona again for joining me, and I can't wait to see what you get stuck into and where you're going to be making an impact.